Okay, so pulling the trigger, how does that work? Now, what I actually recommend most people do before they ever fire a single round from a gun is to get familiar with the trigger. Now I'm going to go through several different handguns and their triggers because they have different weights, different feels, different shapes and designs. For example, this M&P9, I'll go ahead and load a inert round in here. You'll actually notice that this trigger has two sections. Do you see how this bottom part moves before the actual trigger goes back? So there's two sections here. You can actually see behind the trigger, that part goes back before the whole trigger goes back. So this goes back, and then the whole trigger goes back, and then it stops. So this is called taking out the slack, and it's about ready to break. And what that means is, if I put any more pressure, the gun's gonna fire. And there we go. Now, listen for the reset. The reset is when the next round is ready to fire. It means that the firing pin has reset and it's ready to go again. Now, when you fire a live round, it's going to chamber the next round, and now the trigger is reset and the firing pin is ready to go. But I want you to listen while I'm holding this back to the trigger reset. And this is how you know that it's ready to fire again. We're going to slowly let it go forward. There, it's ready to go again. And now the next round goes off. So a lot of times when you see people shooting, you can actually watch their finger. It's called slapping the trigger. You can watch it fly off the trigger. And this is really bad, mostly because it's going to move your gun around when you're shooting. If you can fire and quickly, boom, back on target. See how minimal the gun movement is versus that. So here's slapping the trigger versus off on, right? So when you're shooting, I want you to be aware of the trigger reset. Now, what I'll have most people do is I'll have them dry fire before they ever fire a round so they can feel how much give there is and how much pressure is needed to pull the trigger. Now, the M&P breaks pretty cleanly, but it is a little bit of a heavier trigger in general. Then I'll rack it back. I'll have them slowly let the trigger forward so they can feel it, click, and press again. Now, let's look at a few other ones. This is a Glock, for example, and this one actually has a split trigger. So you can see this middle part here. You can see that this middle part actually depresses before the trigger goes back. So it's got a split trigger, and this allows, if you leave that forward, the trigger doesn't go back. So it's actually trigger safety. So this has to go in before the whole trigger can go back. I'm pushing without pressing that in, and the trigger's stuck. So this allows the trigger to move back. So this is taking out the slack here, and I'm going to press until it breaks. And that's about the same weight as the M&P. Now, we're going to play around with the reset here and see about how much give and break there is. So I'll take out the slack, pull the trigger, reset. Now, what I noticed with this one is once it resets, it's right there. With the M&P, it'll reset, and then you have to take out just a tiny bit of slack. So I actually like this trigger for the reset better, even though I like the break of the M&P a little bit better. And I also like the grip of the M&P better. So now let's look at this compact version, the M&P Shield. I'd be interested to see, this one has the same type of trigger as the full-size M&P. I'll pull back. So there's less slack here, which I kind of like. Pull back. It's a little bit mushier, but there's less slack. Not as clean of a brake actually. Ooh, and that reset, it almost, you gotta be careful with that reset. I actually really don't like the reset on this. You have to really get used to where it is. I'm letting it out and it feels like it's clicking, but you have to go a little bit farther for it to reset. I would actually, I don't know if it's just this model or if it's an old or bad trigger, but I really dislike that reset on here where you go out and you think that you've reset, but you're just shy of resetting. I like the clean, firm brake. So now let's look at a 1911 here. So you can see that there's no trigger safety, but what we do have is we have a grip safety. So this trigger cannot go off, even with this safety turned off. This trigger cannot fire without this being pressed in. So press this in, right? So that's how that works. So it's also a reminder and encouragement to get a nice firm grip on the back here. So we're gonna push back. We're gonna check out so there's basically no slack. It's just kind of the wiggle room of the trigger. There's basically no slack. And clean, crisp brake. Now I believe that stock on a 1911, the trigger weight is between 2.5 and 3.5 pounds. So it's very light. So reset, very small. It's not as sharp as I would like, but I think that's because it does have a light trigger. So let me see. I mean, look at that. Can't even see my finger move. Trigger, another reason why I love the 1911. However, it does sit low, so that recoil all comes over the back, but undeniably the feel, the look, the trigger, stock, I like it quite a bit. So that's the trigger control. Now let's talk about finger placement on the trigger. A lot of places I've seen will teach you to take the very tip of your finger here and press it, put it nice and right on the tip of the trigger like this for sensitivity. This is, in my opinion, BS, because you want to be able to be in control and you decide when that trigger breaks. There's no such thing as letting the gun surprise you. It should not surprise you. You should know when it's going to go off. And you, in a controlled manner, you break the trigger. So all you want to do is when you get that firm grip that we talked about, you're just going to reach inside the trigger guard and put your finger on the trigger. Now, what you'll notice, and a lot of places will teach this, and you can even get targets that'll help with this, is depending on where your finger is on the trigger, if it's way far over or way on the tip, here or way over, it can tend to pull your shots one way or the other. For example, if you're reaching way across, it can tend to pull to one side. If you're putting just the tip of your finger on there, it can tend to push to the other side. So things to be aware of when you're shooting. Just get that nice firm grip, reach inside the trigger guard, rest your finger on the trigger, and you're good to go.